My name's Alan Moore. I write comics.
Remember the 5th of November.
I've been thinking lately about you and me,
You know, it's funny.
about how this is going to end, about who will end up killing who.
This reminds me of a joke.
The whores and politicians will look up and shout, "Save us!" And I'll look down and whisper, "No."
Hello and welcome to the Alan Morecast. I'm your host, Nathan Capitas, and this episode, we're traveling all the way to Terra Obscura, the Tom Strong spinoff that revamps several forgotten Golden Age superheroes. Our guest today is a writer whose work has appeared in comics, music, and TV, having written for 2000 AD and Vertigo, as well as authoring books on REM, The Doors, The Velvet Underground, and much more. Along with artist Steve Parkhouse, he is also the creator of the long-running Resident Alien comic book series, which was turned into a TV show that ran for 4 seasons on Sci-Fi, starring Alan Tudyk. Most pertinent for our discussion today, he also wrote for Alan Moore's America's Best Comics imprint, having co-plotted with Moore and writing the scripts for Terra Obscura. We are very honored to be joined by Peter Hogan. Peter, thank you so much for coming on today.
My pleasure.
So you've had such an incredible career. There's a lot to ask about. But in preparation for this, I came across the introduction you wrote for the unpublished Sandman Presents Marquee Moon special
Oh, okay.
with Pete Doherty, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So there, you posited that the punk movement in the UK in the 70s wound up being a precursor for where all overall culture was headed. And it really put me in mind of Alan Moore and the whole British invasion that swept the American comics scene over the next decade. So Alan always struck me as more of a hippie than a punk, but I am curious to hear your thoughts on how the punk movement might have influenced him and the comics industry in general.
Well, I think when it came down to like the movers and shakers of the hippie scene, those same people turned up 12 years later as punks, or at any rate, hanging out with the whole thing that was going on. Both of them were things you couldn't ignore, and if you were interested in the arts, if you were interested in change, if you were interested in just exciting stuff, you would have showed up for both of those things, which Alan did, and so did I. Well, I think the 1970s largely was pretty complacent. And so everything needed a bit of a shake up, and 2000 AD was kind of a part of that. I think the biggest thing about the most influential thing that came out of punk was just the idea that you can do it. You don't have to go through channels. You don't have to be convoluted about it. Just show up and, do it.
It is similar to comics in that regard. It's a very DIY thing, all you need is an artist or a pen and a pencil yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it helps to have a publisher, but it kind of, gatekeepers aren't as important as people used to think. You do need good editors, I wish we had more of them, but that's a different story.
Well, so one of the things we do to warm up is to get everyone's personal Alan Moore story. So for you, I'm curious, what was your first encounter with the work of Alan Moore?
Of reading? Yeah. I was in a news agent that had one of those old spinner racks, and I noticed this thing that was a brand new comic, brand new English comic called Warrior. And I pulled it out, and it was Miracle Man, and I vaguely remember, well, Marvel Man as it was then. Um, and I vaguely recalled the character from my own childhood. So I was curious, so I bought the thing, and that's how I first came across Alan. And V for Vendetta was in the same thing, and about I don't know, 4 or 5 issues after that. He brought in the Bo Jeffries saga, which I absolutely loved. And so I was hooked. And then I was working in publishing. And so, I rang up Des Skin and we had a meeting, and Des told me where all the stories were going. And I just thought, this stuff is incredible, and I was very interested in trying to get a book collection off the ground. And the publishing company that I was working for was very interested. And then they went out of business about a month later, so it never happened. But that was kind of that led to all kinds of things, and Des introduced me to Alan, and so I had at least some kind of contact with him. And round about that, I mean, that was a boom period for comics in general, and over the next couple of years, it just became more so. And by that point, I was working as a journalist, and the magazines where I was writing for were interested in what was happening with comics, and they said, well, you know about all this stuff. Go off and talk to these people. So I did, and over the course of about a few months, I interviewed Alan and the Hernandez brothers and the young Grant Morrison and Neil Gaiman and all kinds of people. So I interviewed Alan about 3 or 4 times. So the first time was for Watchmen, and over the course of those 3 or 4 interviews, we became friends.
That's incredible. So correct me if I'm wrong, but your debut into comics was editing Crisis? Was there anything before that?
There was. I did a bit of work for Des. He had the license to republish 2000 AD material in sort of US comics format. So I was doing kind of editing, just kind of selecting material and marrying it up to an issue format. So that only lasted a few months. No, the Crisis was the first thing, and what happened was um, was one of the people that I had got to know as a sort of freelance editor, went to work for the 2000 AD group, and he called me up one day and said that Steve McManus, who was the editor of Crisis, really needed a holiday, and was there any chance that I could kind of come in and babysit the magazine whilst he went off and lay on a beach for a couple of weeks. So that's how I got through the door. And after Steve had had his holiday, they asked me to stay on, and that led to me editing and launching Revolver.
Your Revolver, even though it was short-lived, such an incredible magazine. There was a lot of really cool stuff in there. The Jimi Hendrix biography and also Dare, one of my favorite Grant Morrison works.
Right. Yeah, that's true. And Rogan Gosh, which was a real kind of landmark, I think. So yeah, it didn't last long, but it made a real impact.
Well, let's get into our main topic today. Spinning out of Tom Strong number 11 and 12, Terra Obscura reimagined many of the better, netter standard heroes of the Golden Age, such as the Black Terror, Miss Mask, the Fighting Yank, and the original Doctor Strange. Taking place on an alternate Earth on the opposite side of the galaxy, the heroes of Terra Obscura were placed in suspended animation for 30 years following a cataclysmic battle. With help from Tom Strong, the forgotten heroes are freed, re-emerging into a world that has passed them by, but is no less dangerous. Uh, so Peter, I guess the best place to start here is, how did you come to write for America's Best Comics in the first place?
Okay, well, by this point, I was a comic book writer. I'd been doing it for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, and since I knew Alan, every time I did something that I was particularly proud of, I sent him a copy. And so we were sort of vaguely in contact. And then he did an interview, and he launched ABC. I absolutely adored it. Everything about it I loved. And he did an interview a couple of years into it where he said that he already had Rick Veitch and Steve Moore writing for him. And he did an interview in which he said he wanted to invite more writers on board. And so I rang him up because I could and said, if you're serious about this, then I'd really like to be considered for it. And at that point, he said that I was already on the list and it was a very short list, and he'd be in touch. And that took about a year before it came to anything. And then they said, I can't remember whose idea it was, but either Alan or somebody uh, at Wildstorm had thought they should do something with Tesla Strong. And so I wrote The Many Worlds of Tesla Strong, which is a kind of one-off with, about a dozen really fantastic artists. I mean, Scott Doombeer, who was the editor there, had an amazing kind of, Rolodex. He knew every artist on the planet, and he lined up some really, really good ones. So I did that, and that went down really well. At which point Alan said, so what do you want to do next? And I had actually thought about this, and I said, I thought there was, a lot more potential to be had in Terra Obscura. So, I'd like to have a go at that. And then the word came back that the publishers thought that was a great idea, except they didn't want me to do it. They wanted Alan to do it. And Alan was just snowed under. I mean, the whole ABC thing, he'd kind of done largely to provide work for a whole load of artists. But it was absolutely crippling him. He'd taken on this kind of thing, and all of it was like really demanding work. There was Promethea and Top 10, and he was just. It's an amazing, standard that he set with all of that, and I think people will still be talking about it in 20 years' time. So the idea, as far as Alan was concerned, was that he actually wanted to have less work, not more work. So he suggested that we do this thing that would hopefully keep everybody happy, which was that he and I would plot the thing, and then I would go away and write the scripts. And that's exactly what we did. So for about, it was more than a dozen times, I guess 13 or 14 times with each issue, I'd go up to Northampton and sit in Alan's front room, and we'd just talk. I mean, we'd fool around for an hour or two, but then we got down to work, and then we worked really quite hard. And we would go scene by scene, page by page, working out what was going to happen. So we'd started out with like a really big general chat about Terra Obscura and all the characters, and figuring out the broad outlines of the story and who the villain was going to be, and various stuff like that. And then all the meetings after that were kind of specific issue by issue. So we'd do that until some point late in the afternoon, by which point we'd actually kind of nailed it in terms of an issue. And then we'd wander off, and Alan would walk into Northampton and go and do errands, and I would walk into Northampton and catch the train back home. And then I would sit down and write the script over the next, week or so, month or so, however long it took. Some were longer than others. But it was weird. It was having decided very early on that we were going to make Mystico, the mummy, the villain. We talked a bit about Egypt and Egyptian mythology and all the rest of it. And Alan had a few ideas of things he remembered, and he's got an amazing memory. Mine isn't bad either. So I knew that I had about 6 months to learn everything that I could about ancient Egypt and Egyptian mythology and so on. So I read about 6 or 7 books in the course of that 6 months. So, which was kind of daunting in itself, because it's a big subject. In fact, I'm sort of heading back towards Egyptian mythology at the moment, and I just looked on the bookshelf, and I think I've got about a dozen books. So anyway, we did that. We did the first one. That largely went down very well. There were people that thought, I was kind of diluting Alan's genius or something, and they would far rather have read it, just him on his own. But they weren't going to get him on his own in this particular instance. So, I did the best I could. I think we did a pretty good job. And they thought it was good enough that we got a second series out of it, which I don't think was quite as good as the first one, but, it was still a lot of fun. And also, we had Yanick Paquette on board doing just a fantastic art job on the whole thing. So, yeah, I'm pleased with it. I'm still proud of it. I think it stands up. And also, as you probably know, I did some Tom Strong stuff as well. And long after Alan had kind of left the scene, I was talking to the people at Wildstorm about another project, and they sort of turned around and went, "Well, what we'd really like you to do is we'd like you to do some Tom Strong, maybe sort of a long mini series, and but we only want you to do it if Alan's okay with the idea." So I duly went off, and which was very understandable. So I duly went off and asked Alan, and he was fine with it. And so I did 2 Tom Strong miniseries, and the first one was sort of, time travel and robots and Nazis and all kinds of fun stuff. And again, I'm very proud of it. And the second one, I basically had an idea that I wanted to do some more Terra Obscura stuff, and this was the only way it was going to happen. So I did, a series in which Tom has to go to Terra Obscura, and we go and find a place in the middle of a pandemic. And so there's a lot of dying goes on in it, but it's still being the Nador heroes and all of that. It's still very colourful and, quite fun. But that was the end of it, because the powers that be, DC, had changed. And even though Yannick and I, not Yannick, it was Chris Sprouse. We would have loved to do more Tom Strong. I had ideas for 2 more series, and they just really weren't interested. And I mean, basically because they were a pack of idiots. But they were also treating Alan so badly that after that, they just kind of, killed the whole prospect of doing more. Because there's no way I could have, even with Alan's blessing, those guys were treating him so badly that was just the end of it. So they killed the golden goose, but that's completely understandable when you realize the kind of people you were dealing with. DC seem to have turned themselves around a bit, and they're a lot better than they were. But even so, that's kind of the end of it, which is a real shame, because I think Tom Strong was a fantastic character. I think all the ABC stuff was fantastic, and they could have, if they treated Alan decently, he was perfectly willing for other people to go and play with his toys, because he's moved on. He's writing novels now and quite happy doing so. So it's a shame and a waste, but that's the comics industry for you.
It's funny, since last summer when the Superman movie came out and James Gunn listed Tom Strong as one of the inspirations, it feels like that series got a little bit of a second life. So yeah, it feels like they should bring you and Chris back and do some more.
Well, like I say, I don't know that I could, just because they were so nasty to Alan. I saw James's comment. I mean, I think the thing about somebody once said at the time that what they were talking about Tom Strong and Planetary, well, Warren Ellis's thing, and they sort of said it was kind of like there was a kind of wave in comics, and those two things were a part of it. That was like postmodern Silver Age, which I thought was a great phrase, because it really did kind of sum up what that was all about, and it was kind of the joy and the innocence of the Silver Age, but with a kind of, knowing wink to the reader, and kind of modern sensibilities. And as a reader, I'd like to see more of that kind of stuff, but it's just not going on. So,
Oh, for sure. And I think Terra Obscura fell into that category as well.
yeah, I think so.
One of the fun things about the series, or imagine one of the fun things about it, was getting the chance to revamp a lot of those old Golden Age heroes that had fallen out of copyright because it's a little similar to what Moore did with the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, but with even more leeway because a lot of these characters were so ill-defined. They were really just a name and a costume and a power set, but it felt like everything else was pretty much ripe for reinterpretation.
Yeah, they were kind of Division Two characters, but the thing about Alan, and when all said and done, it was Alan that largely did all the groundwork with those two issues of Tom Strong. He picked whatever it was, a dozen characters that weren't that interesting in their own right, and he made them interesting. It's something that he's done a lot of in his career. I never knew this character was that good. Well, no, they weren't. They really weren't that good. It's Alan that's made them good. So that's kind of what all that was about. We added a few more during the course of the two series that we did. And some of them were characters that I found by, doing a whole load of research into the, 1940s stuff. And some of them were things that I made up, just because we needed a couple of characters to, fill a particular gap. But it was great fun to do, There was a real kind of energy to it.
I also must ask more about the experience of collaborating with Alan Moore because I don't think he had done a lot of co-writing at that point.
No, no, he really hadn't. And he's not done that much since then. I think I was, apart from Rick and Steve, where very much, I think, largely he let them do most of the work. He probably gave them some guidelines. But no, I was the first person to actually sit down face to face with him. And I like to think he got something out of it as well, because, writing's quite a lonely business, by and large. It's just you in a room. Um, and so to actually be bouncing back, ideas back and forth, was something that neither of us had that much experience of. It was fun to do. I mean, we had a lot of fun. We laughed like, crazy just for hours and hours. But then, as I say, once we got down to work, we did work very hard. But it was that thing of collaboration. It worked very well for us. I mean, maybe it did because it was kind of a limited time span to it. I think if we'd gone on with it for much longer, Alan might have got fed up with it. But as it was, there was kind of enough for it to be an enjoyable process for him as well as me. And it was a genuine collaboration. I mean, some of the times, Alan would take the lead and other times I'd take the lead. Or somebody would suggest an idea and it was a stupid idea. And, some of those were me and some of those were him. He's not a genius all the time, much as I love him. So yeah, it was great to do, and I'm really glad I had that opportunity. And I knew right from the start that, I'd probably get all the blame for anything that was wrong with it, but it was still, an opportunity that I couldn't turn down because you get the chance to go and learn from, the best writer in the industry. I would have been a fool to say no. So I grabbed it with both hands.
Yeah, one of the things that's become apparent doing this podcast is how adept Moore is in collaborating with his artists. I mean, you look at his scripts, they're famously very long, but they are basically just letters to the artist. So I'm curious to hear if there was anything in particular you learned working with him, and adding to that, anything you were able to apply when working with Yanick Paquette.
It's something that, I mean, I very early on, I mean, when I started writing comics, I'd already talked to Alan about, so how do you do this thing? And I'd seen some of his scripts. So I had an idea of how Alan was doing all of that. And I just kind of followed that path. And I also, through doing Sandman spin-offs, had a lot of contact with Neil Gaiman, who was doing, who was working exactly the same way by and large. So that's kind of like the theoretical side of it. When you're writing, a lot of it you just learn by doing it, by sitting there and opening yourself up to the story, opening yourself up to the characters, and then trusting in that process. So I think what is true though, and one of the things that I noticed then, I was talking to somebody at DC around about the same time, and they said, these short stories that, Alan is doing in, Tom Strong's Terrific Tales and various other titles, and he'd do like a 6-page story, and that would be highly experimental. He was doing a lot of like, well, let's tell the story backwards, let's tell it upside down, and so this person I was talking to said he seems to put as much work into that as he does into, the big, enormous continuing stories, Promethea or From Hell or whatever. I said, yes, he does, for the time that he's working on it, he's kind of completely obsessed with that. And then he finishes it and then moves on to something else. So that had a real influence on me, because one of the things that I learned was, if you're serious about this thing that you're doing and honest about it, then everything you do kind of becomes the hardest thing you've ever done. I mean, there's no point at which you can kind of sit back and coast. It's going to be demanding. It's more like, climbing a mountain. You're not walking up a slope. You're, inching your way up an inch at a time on a sheer rock face. And it's very satisfying, but it's kind of, there there aren't many moments where you're resting. There's always something going on. And that's continued to be the case for me. But I think that's the point. I think working with Alan was the point where I realized it.
Yeah, looking at his work, he doesn't seem to be a man of half measures.
No, it is kind of all or nothing. But that's what makes him so good. And the weird thing is that, and another thing that I noticed, while I was working with him, was that, we'd just be talking about life, or, something that he'd discover here, there, or anywhere, or, funny dream he had the other night. And I would be amazed that, like 3 or 4 months later, it would turn up in Promethea or, one of the other titles. He doesn't waste stuff. And also, if I have an idea in the middle of something, I'll scroll it down in a notebook and think, well, I'll use this one day, but make a note of it so you don't forget it and all the rest of it. Not Alan. If Alan does that, he'll use it right then and there in whatever the thing it is that he's working on. Whether it fits or not, he'll jam it in. He's a great believer in synchronicity, and by and large, it works. Yeah, I think a lot of this stuff is, it's that kind of fine line that, as far as Alan is concerned, there is a fine line between storytelling and magic, and and the lines blur.
Well, another thing I've always been curious about is what happened to ABC A to Z. I believe 4 of a planned 6 issues came out, so I don't know if it was a case where they just decided, once Alan decided to step away, they didn't finish it, or yeah, I'm curious if you have any insight.
Well, the whole thing, no, the whole thing is really weird, because it was one of those things where, Alan was like, okay, I'm wrapping up the, Tom Strong storyline and I'm moving away. I'm done, kind of thing. But somebody had had the idea to do the ABC A to Z, and it only made sense if they were going to do more ABC. If they were going to get, Rick and me and Steve Moore and other people as well to actually, carry the line of comics going onwards. And at some point, they obviously decided that they weren't going to do that. And at that point, they pulled the plug on the ABC A to Z, to the point where it was like, I thought they were going to do a book collection of all this stuff, and then that was cancelled as well. And they literally pulled the plug about halfway through. I wasn't that sad about it myself, because The only thing of mine that didn't appear was I'd done a Smacks entry, and to be honest, it wasn't that good. It was the weakest thing I'd done. So the fact that didn't come out didn't really upset me that much. I would have loved to have seen what Steve Moore was going to do with Promethea, though. I think that's a real loss. I would, but so yeah, I don't know why they cancelled it. I don't know why they didn't do more ABC without Alan. And like I say, I mean, I started talking to Ben Abernathy a couple of years later, and that's how I got to do the two Tom Strong miniseries. And at that point, I thought, well, they could do more stuff, and they could have done. I'm sure Rick or Steve would have been up for doing more, but there you go, it didn't happen.
Another thing I wanted to ask about was your own experience in seeing Resident Alien adapted for the screen, because I think, as we all know, Alan has a complicated relationship with a lot of his adaptations. Of course, he doesn't own the original work in many of those cases, so he doesn't have any control. But yeah, I'm curious if he had any insight or if you talked to him about dealing with adaptations of your own work.
Well, I think, Alan's experience was an unhappy one when it came to dealing with Hollywood. But I think that's largely because, things like Watchmen, he designed it to be a comic, and he was not that interested in, the money side of things. He just didn't want them to do it. And, but, there's a lot of money involved, and Hollywood is very persuasive as far as comics companies are concerned. But Alan kind of just drew a line in the sand. I mean, his thinking about some things is just kind of bewildering to most people. Most people would think, "Oh, great film adaptation," and if it turns out terrible, well, that's that, and at least I got the money, and But Alan is like sort of he's quite absolute in his principles. It's like once he's made his mind up about something, that's that. As for me, it was a kind of different scenario, and I did a sort of proposal for a Resident Alien whereby Steve and I did kind of the first 5 or 6 pages of the comic as part of the package to get a deal. And the minute I started writing that, I thought, this feels like a TV show. And I never had that feeling with any other thing that I'd done. And certainly when we got a deal with Dark Horse, and I think one of the reasons they jumped at it was because Mike Richardson saw the potential that this might work in, as a movie or as a TV show. That it was, it had the kind of oomph to, jump into another medium. And he was right, and I was right, but it took like 10 years before it happened. And then when it finally did, they kind of, completely did their own thing with it. I mean, really doesn't bear that much resemblance to the comic at all. But I was fine with that because it was enjoyable. Sat down to watch the pilot. I was very, very nervous about what it was going to be like. And about 20 minutes in, I thought, I'm actually really enjoying this, and so it went on, and I got to know Chris Sheridan, the showrunner, a bit, and I kind of appreciated what he was doing. So by and large, it was a really good experience, kind of all round. And so yeah, no regrets. Hollywood is crazy, and probably the craziest part of it is the TV end of things. But that kind of goes with the territory, and you just have to live with it. If you come out of it with some money and some enjoyment, and it helps the book sell, it's all good. I mean, I could, in a different kind of state of mind, I could turn around and go, oh, well, they didn't do this. Yeah, they weren't faithful to the comic, but so what, frankly? And in fact, there were a few bits where they did kind of take things from the comic and do their version of them. And I found it really odd because it was kind of like, it was a mixture of them and me. And, and it was just a bit odd. But overall, no, I had a great time with it.
It lasted for 4 seasons, which these days is nothing to sneeze at.
No, it really isn't. And we might not have seen the end of it yet either, because I think a year or so down the line they might do a TV movie or a mini series. It's not impossible. It might happen. We're all still here, so.
Well, to just kind of wrap things up, comic book fans, especially over here in the States, we've had this idea of Alan Moore as cantankerous and reclusive and maybe a little bit scary.
He can be, but he's also a real pussycat. And he's got a great sense of humor. I think one of the things is his accent. It's not just an English accent. It's kind of like that sort of, gruff northern accent that often the humor doesn't come across. A lot of the time it's just very, very dry, and you're not getting the fact that, what sounds like a serious comment is actually a joke. And I think that's where a lot of his reputation comes from. Yeah, he's a nice guy. And he has been treated badly by the comics industry. It's like this thing of sort of like, oh, he doesn't like comics, yeah. Alan still loves comics, and he has a deep rooted kind of love for his childhood was based in this stuff. And his experiences with the business side of the business haven't completely destroyed that. He still likes, the medium. It's the industry he has a problem with.
Yeah, I can certainly understand that. Uh, well, Peter, thank you so much for coming on today. You've had such a fascinating and varied career. You'll have to come back on in the future sometime to talk more. But before you go, is there anything you'd like to plug?
The final trade paperback of Resident Alien will be out in August, and that apart from like the last series, it also contains the last issue. So yeah, mid August, I think that's coming out, and then there'll be a third omnibus coming out sometime next year, and then after that, I think they're going to do a big book of the whole thing.
Thanks once again to Peter Hogan for coming on today. If you only know Resident Alien from the TV show, I highly recommend the comics Peter did with Steve Parkhouse. The final trade paperback in the series, The Book of Changes, is due out on August 18th, so now is the perfect time to catch up and read the whole series. Next week, we'll be joined by writer-artist Kevin Mellon to talk about perhaps one of Alan Moore's most obscure comics, the short story Act of Faith, which originally appeared in Puma Blues number 20. This was a story that I had actually never read before, so I had a blast going through it with Kevin. The story is only 4 pages long, but we had plenty to talk about. Until then, please do subscribe to the Alan Morecast on your podcast app of choice so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. The Alan Morecast is also available on YouTube at the dedicated Alan Morecast channel, so you can also check us out there if you're so inclined. And if you could leave a rating or drop a review, I'd greatly appreciate it. You can also find us online at Instagram at the Alan Morecast for updates and announcements regarding future episodes. And that should do it for this week. Thanks to Michael Fluke for the theme music, and thank you so much for listening. Until next time, praise Glycon.